Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm sure you've all seen a lot of the hate The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom has been receiving for being too expensive, basically just lazy DLC, or just overall a bad game. While many others are calling it a wonderful, jaw-dropping experience filled with almost everything you could ask for. The return of some older, classic Zelda traditions, as well as tons of new characters, puzzles, and everything to put away the fear of everyone who thought it would simply be a letdown with reusing the same overworld. However, Tears of the Kingdom goes above, beyond, and beneath the Hyrule we have grown to love or hate, especially in the rainy seasons. Is one side right? Is the other completely wrong? Or is there some middle ground? In this video, I'll be mixing a few of the most popular complaints, criticisms, and positive thoughts on the game from a lot of the fans with a lot of my own. I would love to hear yours as well, so please comment and let us know what you most loved and what you most hated or disliked about the game. We may end up reading it off and giving you a shout out in a future video or on our podcast, the Hylian Gamescast, when we discuss it. We have videos in this same series of the top 10 best and worst of series for Breath of the Wild, Ocarina of Time, and other games, if you would like to check them out after this video. Tears of the Kingdom truly is a game that comes once in a generation, sadly, but as long as it takes in between major releases in the series, once in a generation seems to be more truth than sarcasm. Starting off at number 1 with one of the best things, and then alternating between the best and the worst. 1. The story is overwhelming. The story of Tears of the Kingdom begins not long after the events of Breath of the Wild, and many people wondered where it could possibly go next. Breath of the Wild did wrap up kind of nicely. Then, years before the official release, Nintendo reveals the first official teaser trailer featuring Link, Zelda, Ganondorf, this rat, and many things that instantly ended all of our doubts on how Nintendo could top the first game, and fueled us all to come up with our own theories and ideas. While some guesses were correct, Nintendo still gave us so much that no one's seen coming, and it greatly surprised us. Not only did it continue on from the great story of Breath of the Wild, but it also gave us even more lore and backstory, which, considering Breath of the Wild's main story was basically backstory, its main DLC, the Champion's Ballad, gave us even more backstory, and Age of Clams was literally entirely a backstory that we still don't officially know if it is a canon Breath of the Wild prequel as it was marketed and said by Nintendo, or if it's more of a what if 𝗵𝗲𝗃𝗃 situation. With so much of this new game also focusing on past events, Tears of the Kingdom manages to keep us hooked in. Instead of Link restoring his memory, like in Breath of the Wild, this time we are collecting the memories of Zelda in the form of tears. I thought it was a great way to make the telling of the story a huge part of the story itself, and implementing them as a puzzle. And it all makes for a much better experience than simply finding memories like in Breath of the Wild. Number 2, the worst. And yes, because Tears of the Kingdom is such a great game, a lot of the worst things about it, or my complaints, are going to just basically be me nitpicking. But there are some situations that Nintendo could have really improved the overall experience with very minor changes. Temples in name only. Okay, I feel like I'm going to get a lot of hate for this one, so let me start out by saying I did enjoy and really like the temples. Some of the designs really stand out and are very creative. They are much better than the Divine Beasts, but feel more like a compromise. One of Breath of the Wild's biggest complaints was the lack of variety in dungeons and bosses. Traditional Zelda mini-dungeons were replaced with Sheikah shrines, which all had the exact same aesthetic and simply became repetitive after a while. Some did manage to stand out and feel more like a traditional dungeon or mini-dungeon, but would still have the same blue aesthetic, making them all just blend together. And again, not stand out. For Breath of the Wild's main dungeon, or temple counterpart, Nintendo gave us the Divine Beasts. These versions of dungeons were great with how they were implemented into the world, the backstory, and played a major role in the game itself. The creativity and design behind them being so dynamic and actually moving around the overworld, and even simply trying to reach them, were great. And again, yes, they were themed like traditional dungeons, but all of them just blend together. Even the bosses were just different Eevee evolutions of Phantom Ganon. Breath of the Wild was amazing, but fans really wanted the return of traditional dungeons and bosses. More shrines could be fine. but give us more variety and make them look different. An example being, no one is ever going to confuse or mix up the ice cavern with Under the Well. However, if you do bring back the shrines, at least give us traditional dungeons or themed temples that are unique and stand out to break up the same copy-paste aesthetic. And Nintendo sort of did this with Tears of the Kingdom. The new versions of temples all look completely different and work well with their themes, but are incredibly short and honestly feel more like mini dungeons. I don't think I would be able to put one of them above any of the dungeons found in a game like Twilight Princess. Usually having you complete what feels like the same exact puzzle multiple times. No one puzzle really stands out from another. In the case of the water temple, the puzzles or problem you need to solve is just turning on multiple water pumps by completing the same style of puzzles we find in the overworld. There's nothing to make the temple itself stand out. And interestingly, the mini dungeon, Ancient Zora Waterworks, which you complete before the water temple and return to after, actually felt more like a traditional water temple than this game's version of the actual water temple. And I have similar thoughts on the other temples. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom do such a great job of giving callbacks and references to past games. And again, this is where Tears of the Kingdom is lacking. They even had perfect opportunities. Again, using the water temple as an example, it's usually always underneath the water in the middle of Lake Hylia, with the entrance built into the bottom of an island. And yes, it was renamed the Lakebed Temple in Twilight Princess. Despite having many of these in Tears of the Kingdom's Lake Hylia, Nintendo breaks lore and has the source of Hyrule's water. Nintendo breaks lore and suddenly has it in the sky, which makes Lake Hylia, which is always a prominent location in Zelda games, suddenly feel like it's completely unimportant. Nintendo also uses this water temple to break lore and has the source of Hyrule's water now being in the sky, not Zora's domain. The temples were always incredibly important to each of the individual races. In Tears of the Kingdom, the temples were barely even known of by the characters. Many of the races would never even be able to reach their temple. As great as the temples themselves are, they just don't feel as important when compared to past games. Almost as if they were not actually meant to be named after temples, but were only given the names because fans wanted themed temples to return. So they took what they were already making and just named them after the past temples as a compromise to please fans, when in reality they're more like mini dungeons that have no actual connection to the temples themselves. 3. Back to one of the best, a truly dynamic overworld and thoughtful NPCs. One of the things Nintendo stated about Breath of the Wild while it was still in development was 𝗟𝗏𝗄 or Fujibayashi mentioning how the overworld itself would be very dynamic and continue to grow and evolve as you play the game. Sadly, all we ended up was getting Tarrey Town, which was still great, and one of the most memorable side quests, but the feature creating Link's house with the different segmented blocks was originally designed to create different houses for people in Breath of the Wild, but was removed. However, Tears of the Kingdom has all of this. Almost everywhere you go in this game looks very different and feels much more alive than it did in Breath of the Wild. The NPCs are a huge part of this. Not many stood out in the first game, but Tears of the Kingdom gives a lot of them their own jobs, places to be, overall importance to the story, and much more of an impact on the gameplay. And tying back in with the dynamic overworld, it feels as if they are actively involved in making that happen. One example being Lurelin Village being completely destroyed and the people living there being missing. We are able to have a group fight alongside Link, clearing out these large areas of the map that have been overtaken in order to rebuild. So many of the characters are given an actual purpose, and it makes it feel much more like the NPCs and side quests from Majora's Mask, but on a much larger scale. 4. The worst. Timeline obscurity. The story and lore we are given in Tears of the Kingdom is amazing, but I have seen some people being very negative and critical about it, or not understanding it. The game itself seems to contradict what 𝗟𝗏𝗄 and others at Nintendo have told us about it. I'll start by saying I have this video here, which I believe perfectly explains where Breath of the Wild takes place on the timeline and exactly how that is possible. Using in-game lore, and interviews with quotes directly from 𝗟𝗵𝗲 and others at Nintendo. When asked about Breath of the Wild's timeline placement, we were told it takes place long after the events of Ocarina of Time, and confirmed this was the exact same Ganondorf introduced in Ocarina of Time, who went on to have many battles with Hyrule. They would also mention that they do know where it takes place in the timeline, and it was designed to be there. But Nintendo thought it would be more enjoyable for fans to discover that for themselves while playing the game, so they didn't want to spoil it. They also said the reason it takes place so far in the future is so they can easily reference many of the things from throughout all of the games without being solely dependent on a single game before it, which is also sort of the reason most games take place hundreds of years apart from each other. An example being the entirety of Wind Waker just couldn't exist if it took place shortly after Ocarina of Time. However, give it a few hundred years, suddenly you have time to bring back Ganondorf, have the world flood over, give us all new locations, lore, and everything, including being able to completely change the well-known Kokiri to the Koroks, and the Zora into the Rito. If it only took place a few years or even a decade after Ocarina of Time, none of it could have happened. So instead, Nintendo usually allows an unknown number of years to take place between the games. Breath of the Wild just happens to do so on a much larger scale. In my opinion, Breath of the Wild is able to perfectly do what it set out to do, while also fitting perfectly in its spot as a convergence at the end of each of the timelines. Again, we have this video that explains it in great detail. Despite Tears of the Kingdom being a direct sequel of Breath of the Wild, taking place shortly after it and being a direct continuation, as well as originally being designed and planned as DLC for Breath of the Wild itself, it seems to take the world and characters, give us a great new story, but make it so vague that many players felt it purposefully threw away all of those connections Breath of the Wild had, and which Nintendo themselves confirmed. However, if you know the timeline, it is still possible to take the backstory of Tears of the Kingdom and have it perfectly match with the timeline we all know. Nintendo just introduces so many new things that it's hard to have all of these many new dots connect. And at first, seems like not only did they forget about it tying in with the official timeline, but the new lore we are given doesn't even match up with Breath of the Wild's own lore or backstory. A quick example being the Zonai. Were they an ancient evil barbarian race like Breath of the Wild tells us, that mostly lived in the middle of the woods? Or are they angelic, godlike creatures that founded Hyrule? Literally the exact opposite of what Breath of the Wild tells us, and what even Nintendo themselves told us about the Zonai. It seems like they already had plans for these characters and Rauru, but because they knew fans wanted Zonai, they just changed them to be Zonai. People believe there is no way this is the same Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess, and some other games. His story in the game makes it seem like it's a completely different Ganondorf, yet it still has scenes like this of him doing the exact same pose and bow we see him do in Ocarina of Time. This new version of Rauru explains that he founded Hyrule, created the Temple of Time, and was apparently the first king of Hyrule. This seems impossible at first, because we think Link and Zelda lead to Hyrule being created after the events of Skyward Sword, which is what happens in the official timeline as well, as it is created between Skyward Sword and Minish Cap. This was also the same time the Temple of Time was created. In Ocarina of Time, Rauru even tells us himself he did in fact create the Temple of Time, but we are never aware of him being a king, though it does seem like that was the original plan for him, and especially his design. We never see the actual king of Ocarina of Time's Hyrule, but every other design of the king of Hyrule continued to be modeled after Rauru. Even in Skyward Sword, Zelda's father, who wasn't king, is modeled and named after Rauru. So it could be that Rauru was actually meant to be the king and became a sage, or at least a previous king. Though if this Rauru says he founded Hyrule and created the Temple of Time, how did this new Rauru create the Temple of Time and found Hyrule? As for Rauru looking different in this game and being a Zonai, we have to remember Zonai literally means mystery. So it could be these Zonai are just ancient Hylian or evolved Hylians, like the Zora into the Rito and the Kokiri to the Korok, the Sheikah and Gerudo into the Twilight. So maybe a set of ancient Hylian began to look like this, and then being referred to as Zonai later on. As for why his appearance is so different, it is odd, but still makes sense. We know 𝗏𝗏 can change forms between an owl and his normal appearance. The next king in Wind Waker, again designed after 𝗏𝗏, even changes into a boat. Link himself is known to transform in several games, so it can still make perfect sense for this new 𝗏𝗏 to have been able to make himself look more like the way he does in Ocarina of Time. So everything does still technically connect and make sense. With more casual fans, it may just seem like Tears of the Kingdom is supposed to be its own thing, not just outside of the timeline, but even outside of Breath of the Wild. Since we know Breath of the Wild is confirmed to be in the timeline, it all just makes what people already think is a confusing timeline a bit more confusing. The game in its entirety, the story, gameplay, lore, everything could be the exact same. But with only barely tweaking a few things and better explaining the lore, Nintendo could have had it connect a lot more obviously without causing so much confusion. The only real issue is Ganondorf, but again, he can still be explained, which I'll be making a more in-depth video on very soon. 5. Good. Fixing almost all of Breath of the Wild's issues. This is very simple. Nintendo always does an amazing job listening to fan feedback and correcting any issues fans may have with previous Zelda games. I've seen a million different people say Nintendo never listens to fans or fan feedback. Nintendo just doesn't care. However, that couldn't be further from the truth. Wind Waker received more negative feedback than any other Zelda game, so with its cartoony art style. So, despite Wind Waker 2 already being in the middle of development, Nintendo listened to a lot of fans saying they didn't like the cartoony art style and being limited to the smaller islands to explore as opposed to a giant Hyrule. So they completely threw out Wind Waker 2 and all of their hard work to create what became Twilight Princess, the exact opposite of Wind Waker with its realistic and dark art style instead of cartoony and bright. Now we had the largest overworld to explore in all Zelda games. People would give feedback that Hyrule being so large was great but felt empty. And now nostalgia was kicking in and people were missing the cartoony style of Wind Waker. So we got a mix of the art styles with Skyward Sword, and instead of a large empty Hyrule, we now had 3 main smaller areas completely filled with details and multiple islands in the sky to explore. Nintendo purposefully tried to make it feel as packed in with content as possible and not have any area feel empty. Again, Nintendo would listen to Skyward Sword's feedback and get rid of the one-to-one motion controls, which they had stated they couldn't imagine attempting to make a new Zelda game without one-to-one motion controls. But thanks to them listening to fans, motion controls were barely a part of Breath of the Wild, and even the remake made it optional. The feedback was also the reason Breath of the Wild had such a large connecting open world instead of segmented areas, and why the game had such a major focus on the Sheikah. Nintendo continued this with Tears of the Kingdom. They fixed almost everything fans had complaints with, and even added a lot of things that fans simply asked for, like finally knowing who the Zonai is, and more backstory. They did it creatively as well, instead of taking the easy or lazy way of just doing away with some of the issues. They built new ideas and gameplay to solve those issues. Did you hate climbing in the rain? Now you have more options to not slide, and it's much less annoying. Did you hate your weapons breaking and the item durability? Now you have new ways to continually restore your weapons. Did you miss actual bombs being in the game? Here they are. Did you hate all of the bosses being repetitive? Here are new bosses that are all completely different and unique. Did you want the companion characters to be actual companion characters? Now they are and fight alongside you. You felt certain areas felt empty? Now it's completely changed. Also, all of those cool glitches fans and speedrunners found and loved, like flying across Hyrule or launching yourself to the other side of the map, now it's actual gameplay, a feature, not a bug. And we're going to have a lot of the game designed completely around the stuff you love to do in Breath of the Wild, while also giving you completely new things to do. Tears of the Kingdom really is the perfect response to almost all of the positive and negative feedback from Breath of the Wild. 6. Bad. Not fixing other issues. Yes, I know, a bit contradictory, but while most of the complaints were fixed or solved, others weren't, one being underwater exploration. Aside from Wind Waker, Link is able to swim and explore underneath the water. A lot of great gameplay, puzzle designs, and more come because of this. In Tears of the Kingdom, we have a way to swim up waterfalls, but Link can't go 2 inches beneath the surface of the water. It's a bit confusing because we even have concept art of Link underwater. We have treasure found all over Hyrule throughout different lakes, ponds, rivers, and the ocean. Yes, we can retrieve them with different abilities, but why not let us simply swim to them like other games and put on something heavy to weigh down, like the Iron Boots did? My original reasoning as to why they didn't include underwater exploration in Breath of the Wild, because if I was Nintendo and I was creating this ultimate Zelda game, Breath of the Wild, which has so many different things from almost all of these Zelda games and lets you do almost anything you can imagine, how could you possibly make the next Zelda game even better? So I thought Nintendo purposefully left out certain gameplay mechanics just so they could bring it back in a sequel or follow-up Zelda game as a way to make them feel even more different from each other. It just feels odd being given a water temple that requires no underwater exploration, and honestly doesn't even really require swimming at all, despite having armor that allows us to swim faster. 7. Good. Link and Zelda's relationship. I love the idea for certain incarnations of Link and Zelda to have more than a close friendship. Ocarina of Time originally had Link and Zelda growing romantic with each other, and even Navi being jealous of Zelda, but it was removed before the game was released. Minish Cap had them as lifelong best friends. Skyward Sword took it a bit further, with them being very close best friends, and having implied something more between them with the flirting and teasing. Even the background music and emotions in these scenes helped build this. It seemed Gnome was only jealous of Link and rude to him simply because Gnome had a crush on Zelda and knew Zelda had a crush on Link. Breath of the Wild took this a step further, and more than ever, we got to explore Link and Zelda's relationship as a real relationship. They never stopped caring about each other, but we got to follow along with them during the roller coaster of emotions and seeing how the relationship grew. We see scenes when Zelda is excited and happy just to be around Link, when she is upset and arguing with him. We see more intimate moments when they are in the rain, or when she is in the goddess spring, and Link being polite and looking away. We see her break down and crying on him, the look she gives him when Link saves her, and even moving away from cutscenes. It's also implied in Zelda's diary, and in the Japanese version of Link's compendium. And Breath of the Wild finally ends with them reconnecting and enjoying their time together. Most Zelda games end with Link and Zelda being closer than ever, and hinting at more. But since the game is over, we are left to imagine what happens next. Finally, in Tears of the Kingdom, we have obvious evidence of them not only being more than friends, but even living together in Link's house, and many other hints. The voice actress has even commented that, in her opinion, they are definitely in a romantic relationship. For as many people who love the ZeLink idea, and so many games only hinting or teasing it, it is finally great to see Nintendo actually commit to the idea and show us a glimpse of their lives together. 8. Bad. Missing characters. I understand certain fan favorite characters not being in the game. Everyone loved the champions, but it's obvious why they would have little or nothing to do in this game, and it really is nice to see their legacy passed on, and how the new sages are taking their place and finally growing without them. However, certain characters like KASS, whose family is still in the game, is seemingly missing. Like, did he die and we don't know? Is he on his own adventure? He is one of the characters in Breath of the Wild that could be found almost anywhere, and was even a main focus in the DLC. It's like having Hudson, Beetle, or even someone like Sidon just not being mentioned. 9. Good. Reimagining the world and going beyond. So many people originally hated the idea of Tears of the Kingdom reusing the same version of Hyrule, despite Nintendo stating they would just be using it as a base and adding to it. Even after we learned of caves and sky islands being a main feature of the game, people still claimed it's just the same Hyrule we already explored. Nothing new. It's just overpriced DLC. Not enough to make a full game. This simply isn't the case. Not even including the sky islands or depths below. Tears of the Kingdom does much, much more to change the land of Hyrule than we've seen with A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds. We now have completely new areas, villages, and more. We also have several brand new abilities and gameplay mechanics that make exploring and interacting with this world very different. Simply changing the Rito ability from lifting you high in the air with 𝗶𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗀𝗀 skill to giving you a boost while gliding makes traveling feel completely different. And we still have the same ability of 𝗶𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗀𝗀. They didn't just throw it away. It's just now in the form of a rocket or other Zonai devices. Some areas that we never would have visited twice in Breath of the Wild and just ignored are now full of characters, quests, or even its own village. We also have the Sky Islands, which themselves are like a mix of the islands from Skyward Sword and Wind Waker, spread all over the sky. Some containing overworld boss fights, puzzles, dungeons, caves, enemies, important characters, unique items or weapons, and tons of exploration. And I'm not even going to get started on the depths below because I don't want to have nightmares. Bonus bad. It ends. Yeah, this is a real tragedy. I know it's supposed to be a top 10 of the best and worst things about the game, but I didn't want to end on a bad note. So here's a bonus before the real final. Tears of the Kingdom reused so many assets of Breath of the Wild, and even had a lot of its content already finished, or at least were ideas that were done but cut from Breath of the Wild. Nintendo has stated this many times, and was hoping it to not just allow them to continue the story of Breath of the Wild and its characters, but would also help speed up development time. Instead of building everything from the ground up on a brand new console with a brand new engine, and having that slow learning stage of what can and can't be done on the console or the new engine, like with Breath of the Wild, they already had experience with all of this, and now it's just being developed for a single console as opposed to having it work on two. If Breath of the Wild took 5 or 6 years with all of its setbacks, Tears of the Kingdom, with all of the experience and reusing assets, should barely take half that long. Sadly, it took even longer than the original. With as great and amazing as Tears of the Kingdom was to play, and the amount of time we all waited for it, the absolute worst thing is it's now over and has ended. However, DLC is very, very likely, and I'll be doing a top best and worst of it when it releases as well. So at least we have something to look forward to while we wait for the next mainline Zelda game, and hopefully it won't take nearly as long to complete. Waiting until 2029 or 2030 for the next main Zelda game would break my heart. 10. Good. A future glimpse of what to expect, mixing old and new. Continuing with the theme of Tears of the Kingdom being complete, Nintendo has confirmed they have already begun working on the follow-up Zelda game and gave some details. This isn't anything new. Nintendo has stated many times that development for the next game will begin while the current game is still in development and has yet to release. So this was kind of common sense that they would have begun putting together ideas and begin pre-production of whatever the next big game is. So far, they have only stated they want to continue this style of open world gameplay and exploration. My only hope is they will continue taking in fan feedback, and we will get something that is more of a mix of the dungeons in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and combine it with the giant, traditional, themed dungeons and temples of games like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. And if not combined, then maybe having both as dungeons or temples for fans who liked both. With the DLC for Breath of the Wild, as well as Age of Clams, all doing amazingly well, it is a bit obvious we can look forward to amazing DLC for Tears of the Kingdom as well. Thank you all so much for watching the video, and please, if you made it this far, consider subscribing and commenting below. It really does help us out. Hello everyone, I just want to say thank you for watching the video all the way through. Some of you have been asking, and yes, we still have shirts and other merch available at teespring.com. You can find a link in the description below. If you purchase one and send us a picture wearing it, we will give you a shout out and include your picture during one of our upcoming videos. Thank you to our amazing Patreon supporters, starting off with our royal family, Shadow to Us. On our champion tier, Justin Clark, Monica Spath, SoberX. In the Sheikah tier, Andremoy, Joseph, Natsu, Wrecker1, Rusty Caulfield, Tremel. And in the Kokiri tier, Gene Pinna, Chad Costin, David Guthman, Candy, Disappointment, Gus Calvo, Zane, Lean, Lovable Christie, Mr. Monocled Metroid, and whoever this is only donated to hear Jesse speak my name. Thank you all so much. If any of you would like your name to be featured at the end of any of our videos, or to get a shout out at the beginning of our Zelda podcast, the Hylian Gamescast, and to have any of your topics or questions answered or turned into a full video to be featured here on our channel, along with many other things, please join our Patreon and help support the channel. Thank you all so much. Happy Halloween.